Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg podcast, brought to you as always by InsideThePenguins.com, a proud affiliate of the Hockey News. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Horwat, and we have a pretty good show for you guys today. Everybody obviously has talked about Kyle Dubas now that it's come to the end of his very first season. We're going to evaluate that first season, the good, the bad, and the ugly of Kyle Dubas through 1 year as Pittsburgh Penguins president and general manager. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about not NHL hockey. First and foremost, the IIHF Worlds are about 3 weeks away. Which Pittsburgh Penguins have already declared their intent to go play in Czechia? Which Pittsburgh Penguin could end up joining them over in Europe? We'll talk about that in the second segment, and then we'll finish it off by talking a little AHL hockey. The Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins kicked off their playoff season last night. We'll talk about what they were able to do against the Lehigh Valley Phantoms and take a look at some interesting pieces in that lineup as they get set for game 2 on Friday night. But before we get into that, obviously a quick reminder, we're doing a Jaromir Jagr bobblehead giveaway. If you haven't watched any shows over the last week and a half, because we've let off every show with it, it'll be announced on April 30th. The winner will be, I should say. There's 2 ways to enter. You can check that out at the pinned tweet at Ice-Burgh Podcast or at the beginning of any video that we've had over the past week and a half. So I'm not going to go down the whole spiel. It's subscribe. It's leave a 5-star review, screenshot it, all that fun stuff. But you should know the rules by now. If not, check out our pinned tweet because the rules are all laid out there for you. But let's get into this evaluation of one Kyle Dubas. Obviously, last offseason, the Penguins had a long search for their president of hockey operations and for a general manager, and it turned out that it all came in one package, and that was the former general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Kyle Dubas, who after about 2 weeks off the job, he signs a long extension, or a long deal, I should say, with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and under a calendar year, but a full season later, Pens are out of the postseason. They finish in the same place in the Metropolitan Division, which is 5th, and they end up with actually a worse record than they had last year under Ron Hextall, Brian Burke, and that company. So Horwat, overall, we're going to give grades. We're going to talk best move, worst move, but overall, what is your feeling on Kyle Dubas heading into year 2 after this first season has come to an end?
Once again, I'd say cautiously optimistic. It wasn't going to take him, it wasn't going to be an overnight success for trying to filter out what Ron Hextall had brought to the team. I forget where I saw the graphic or if it was just a tweet or whatever it may have been, but the only piece remaining from the Ron Hextall era in Pittsburgh is Rickard Rakell, who we'll discuss in a little bit. But he's the last guy. Everyone else, aside from maybe some front office faces that were just a little unaware of, and obviously the coaching staff, which might see a change, they're all Ron Hextall people, all the players, or at least not anymore. Sorry, I should say. They are all now either Dubas or, if you want to take it back concerning the core, Ray Shero guys, or Jim Rutherford even, I think. But I think even Rutherford's cleaned out quite a bit. It might be Brian Russ, but he was a draft pick and an old one, so he may have been Shero, especially with Gensel gone now too. That being said, it's an interesting graphic, and that how quickly Dubas has kind of turned things over. And sure, it should kind of tell you that, okay, with all those names gone, shouldn't the product already be a bit more of a net positive? Not quite, because it's sometimes that first year can be a little trial and error, considering you as Kyle Dubas are still getting used to the team and what they are used to and what these players are keen on. You got to find those right guys. And there are certain names that definitely he hit on. We'll discuss a few, and there are definitely some names that he missed on. Again, we'll discuss them. So I'd say overall, I'm still cautiously optimistic going forward, because he's not going to take losing as an answer. That's, as he said, not acceptable around the team, around the city. And there's going to be a drive to do something more in the final years of Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang, even if 2 of those 3 are on a decline.
Yeah, trial and error is a perfect way to explain it, because you look at what the plan was going into the season. Kyle Dubas constructed at least the forward core to help out his defense and be, the bottom 6 be all defense, top 6 all offense, with, obviously Crosby has his own 200-foot game. Jake Gensel has an underrated 200-foot game coming into the season. So the plan was top 6 offense, bottom 6 defense. That's pretty much the dichotomy there. And that was an error because it didn't work out, because the bottom 6 did, as you expected, not produce offense. They did have some defense, but the top 6 wasn't able to carry that load. So as you saw throughout the year, he started to amend that plan. You started to see some younger players come up. He started to shift his focus on what he wanted to do. And that's what brings us to, what were some of his best moves? What were some of his worst moves? Horwat, I think there's less good moves than bad moves, but also because of just the pure quantity of additions that he brought into the lineup and into the organization, like you mentioned. I mean, yeah, would a Vinny Hinostroza be considered a success or a failure? I mean, he's been fine at the AHL level, but again, you look at, what he was able to bring at the NHL level as a 13th forward, potentially a 14th forward, potentially, it wasn't very much. And by the end of the season, he wasn't used very often. I mean, you look at a guy like Andreas Janssen, brought in to be given a shot. He's out of the organization before even the halfway point of the season, and he's heading over to Europe to play, in his homeland. So there's a lot of positives. There was a lot of negatives. Let's start with the negatives. What do you think was Kyle Dubas's worst move of year one?
Worst move is tough to tell. I think you'd have to maybe jump to the signings in terms of Ryan Graves being there. If you want to make the argument for Tristan Jarry, you probably could, but we've also backed Jarry as much as we could. We'll see what this summer holds for him. At the moment, it feels like the Ryan Graves signing, just based on the number, based on the contract, and based on that performance, it really couldn't be anyone else. At least Riley Smith was healthy for the whole season, completed the year. At least Riley Smith contributed at times, showed to be a useful asset at times, and maybe could have been utilized at the trade deadline for more pieces or whatever it may have been, but wasn't. The thing about Ryan Graves was even if Dubas was hanging him out for a trade, no one was going to bite. So that kind of holds Ryan Graves in a higher standard of worst move so far by the Kyle Dubas administration, and by a wide margin, but also Riley Smith is still kind of right there, and we'll see where it goes, especially if Riley Smith didn't want to be here in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan Graves was an anchor from day one, and that never really subsided. Like, every once in a while, he'd have a good performance, and you'd say, okay, maybe this is the game that turns it around for Ryan Graves. But 98% of the time, Ryan Graves was an anchor for this organization and for this team this season. They're going to, from the outside, it looks like they're going to give him a second year to try to get his feet underneath him and try to make it worth it for that contract, because I mean, that's the other thing that comes into this. That's a 6-year deal. You're not getting rid of that easily. And even if you do, you're probably either paying something or retaining something, or it's gonna come back to bite you even if you get rid of that contract. So I would agree that Ryan Graves is probably the worst, but there were some other moves that when you look at them from the outside, it's not all necessarily on the player performance this year, but a 3-year contract for Noel Acciari is questionable. I understand that he brings more defense than offense, and we shouldn't be judging him based on his offense. But, year 2 and year 3 of that contract, is he going to be just another Jeff Carter where you're looking at it and you're saying, man, I wish he could bring a little bit more. Now, he does hit a little bit more than Carter ever did. He obviously blocks shots, kills penalties more than Carter has done in the past couple of years. So I'm not going to get overly aggressive about that move, but a Matt Nieto, I understand that he was injured and that's unfortunate, but even when he was playing, didn't look like a great addition to this team, and giving him a multi-year contract is also a questionable decision. The only thing is we only saw him for 15, 16, however many games,
20 something, I think.
And then he just never came back. So it's hard to judge that one. But again, it appeared on the outside, at least up to that point, that it was going to be another negative asset brought into the team. Third line was okay. Zahorna ended up being a miss. I mean, he gave him a couple opportunities. He had some moments, but he was a miss overall. I think there was a lot of misses, and that's going to be held against him after 1 year. But as you mentioned from the start of this, you do have to remember of the position he was put in, or he put himself in when he joined right after Hextall, and how far down the road of being one of the worst teams in the NHL this team was, and how bad of a position they were in with contracts and everything because of Ron Hextall's work. So He's digging himself out of a hole, and that has to be taken into account. But there were a lot of missteps as well.
Yeah, it wasn't going to be an easy job from the get-go. We all knew this.
Mhm.
I mean, you were tied to the Jeff Carter contract, and that's going to be off the books soon, which is nice. And, a fond farewell for Jeff Carter that he ended up turning in a pretty decent season, albeit expensive.
Yes.
For his position. And he didn't really he did what he could. He sent out the not anchors, but just the bloated deals of Jeff Petrie, Mikael Granlund, and Jan Rutta, all in one fell swoop, no less.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd say overall, I think did we already give grades to, why do I feel like we've done this before now that I'm saying things out loud? Overall, you're giving Kyle Dubas a pretty passing grade, I'd say, because it wasn't over the top great, but it wasn't a complete failure. There were some positives to be pulled, and there are some positives to be pulled. And you have to figure, if you're filing in terms of a grade for Kyle Dubas, which we'll get to, he built the prospect system finally, or at least got the groundwork laid out for that. So his job was to win now and build for the future, as everyone's job is. But whereas the win now might be murky, the future is getting brighter, and that's a net positive.
So you mentioned the move that obviously got Granlund, Petrie, and Rutta out of the door, and Casey DeSmith was included in that trade, which was obviously the Erik Karlsson trade. Do you think that was the best piece of business Kyle Dubas did over his first season with the Pens?
No, I am going to have to land on the Michael Bunting trade. Now, I know it's the Jake Guentzel trade, but hear me out on this. Because Michael Bunting, fills a void that has been missing, that's going to, seeing him for a whole season in Pittsburgh is going to be massive. That's going to be huge. I'm not going to fully put hang my hat on this, but if the Carolina Hurricanes cannot come to a deal with Jake Guentzel before the free agency market opens, there's already people saying that the Penguins are going to be right in line to have conversations with Jake Guentzel again. So what's better than just Michael Bunting? Michael Bunting and Jake Guentzel again. I'm not hanging my hat on that, but that's still a possibility. And that is something to definitely keep an eye on for everyone that, believes that it was a bad idea to trade away Jake Guentzel. For what it's worth, though, I just think because it's very unlikely Jake Guentzel returns, you're getting Michael Bunting for solid production, a good deal, and might breathe some life back into the end days of Evgeny Malkin, especially.
Yeah, when I look at that trade and I see people saying, well, look how close you came to the playoffs. If you would have had Jake Guentzel, where would you have been? That's a big if, because if you look at where the team was heading before the Guentzel trade, just the week leading up to it, it was trade a guy that is on an expiring deal that you haven't had, from all reports and all indications, you haven't had positive interactions with when it comes to the contract negotiation side of things. So it didn't look like you were a sure bet to bring this guy back in the offseason. Do you want to lose that type of player for nothing, or do you want to get something? I understand. We talked about it around the trade deadline that it would have been nice to get, some of their better prospects from Carolina, a Nadeau, a Morrow, some of these other guys. But Koivunen, Ponomarov, and like you mentioned, Bunting, who could help immediately and already paid dividends for Evgeny Malkin in the second line. I think that from the position he was in, he did a pretty decent job. Am I going to give it an A? No. But I think as this is broken down, as time has gone on, it certainly looked a lot better with Koivunen leading Liga in postseason scoring, with Ponomarev looking decent before getting injured, and with Michael Bunting becoming a cult hero in 20 games in Pittsburgh. It certainly, I think, has softened the blow of losing Guentzel. And also, when you look at the fact that, they might still have that opportunity to sign him, but if Carolina signs him, or if he signs somewhere else for an absorbent amount of money, you probably wouldn't have been able to match it anyway, especially with the extension to Sidney Crosby coming up as early as July 1st of this season. So I agree with you that was on the side of better, right? If we're talking about good moves versus bad moves, that was a good move from Kyle Dubas. And I understand it could have been better. It could have been,
Yeah.
but it was a good move. And along those same lines, I'm going with his other big move. I think it is the Erik Karlsson trade is his best move. It shifted the eras of Hextall versus Dubas and immediately brought in that new feel. Erik Karlsson immediately rose the stock of the Pittsburgh Penguins upon that trade. Was his season everything that everybody would have hoped it would be? No, but at the same time, you get Mikael Granlund off the books, you get Jeff Petrie off the books, you get Jan Ruda off the books, and you get Casey DeSmith off the books and give yourself an opportunity to bring in Alex Nedeljkovic. How many times during the Hextall era did I say, well, he did a good job of cleaning out this era or cleaning out this roster and giving himself an opportunity to make a splash move, but he replaced it with something poor. Granlund is point A at trade deadline last season. You cleared everybody out. You thought, okay, maybe it's Chychrun, maybe it's somebody else that could really help this team, and it ends up being Mikael Granlund, and he looks horrible with the Penguins after the trade deadline. Dubas brought in Karlsson, and I thought that Karlsson, again, we've talked about his year, so I'm not going to go into it deeply, but even a small microcosm of that is you clear out Casey DeSmith and a goaltending tandem that needed some change, and you bring in Alex Nedeljkovic, who was a breath of fresh air this year, even though his numbers were very similar to what DeSmith had done.
Yeah, the numbers might be similar, but moving out on Granlund, and you're right, the way you put it is Ron Hextall was clearing out names like Teddy Bluger to maybe free up the space for, maybe a Jacob Chychrun. Remember how long the Penguins were in on, I think it was Brock Besser for a while, and then switched to Connor Garland for a while, and then maybe I think there was one other Canuck in there. JT Miller, which at the time I think we were all absolutely against. Looking back, well, that team is a cup favorite all of a sudden. We'll see, but even bringing on JT Miller was going to be a bad idea because of the contract. So there were those three Canucks that the Penguins were maybe in on for a long time. And even adding JT Miller, as absorbent as that contract is, would have at least been a name, right? Mikael Granlund used to be a name. I'd say if that trade was done 3 years prior, I think we had this discussion too, 3 years prior to when it actually happened, we're having a bit of a different reaction. But because of the missed timing of it, it was a failure of a deal. And what did Kyle Dubas come in? Immediately flipped that. Immediately flipped Petrie after 1 year with the team. He wasn't there for the start of it, but still, after just 1 year with the team, gone. And Casey DeSmith was kind of just overdue for a move, gone. Jan Ruda, also after 1 year with the team, gone. And he managed to fill that in with more cap hits in Erik Karlsson. So be it. It's a deal that seemed to have worked out and will work out down the line. And it also cost you few prospects. Do you remember that part of it? Sure, the first round pick goes out the door. But it was Nathan Legare, who was supposed to be really good. He ended up getting traded midway through the season too. So I think that's in terms of not losing prospects in that deal is a very much net positive. He was the only prospect involved, right? At least the biggest name.
As far as I remember. I mean, the Penguins got back Dylan Hamiluk, who's on the ECHL Wheeling Nailers, who are winning their playoff series right now. So obviously that's, very small consolation there. But I do think that was his best move. Now, again, is it unmitigated success? No, I don't think he's had any unmitigated success moves, any that have 100% worked out, nor do I think that very many general managers have that often. So we'll see what he's able to do in year number 2. But before we move over and talk a little bit about the World Championships, what would you grade year 1 of Kyle Dubas? We graded his offseason as we went into this into the year. What would you grade year 1 in totality for Kyle Dubas? Letter grade here.
I'm gonna go C+. Yeah, I think that sounds about right, because there were some positives there. The positives aren't being outweighed by the negatives, but some of those negatives may turn into positives. Let's say Noel Acciari has to come back for another season and has a healthy year and is a shutdown forward. Maybe he moves to a wing. Then suddenly you're looking at that negative as a net positive next year. Maybe Matt Nieto returns and is healthy for a full season and performs in a depth role. All right, then that can also be a net positive. Like I mentioned before, when you're putting letter grades on things, you also have to look at how he built the prospect system a little bit more than what it was.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to boost his grade up. And we'll see how many of those prospects join the team and how many of those how much of that decision making he has in allowing these youngsters to fight for NHL spots.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be huge as well. So I'd say C+ for now, and that it could slide to a B- really easily.
Mm-hmm. I'm between a C- and a C, but I'll stick with a C. I mean, here's a couple of things that I didn't like about his first season. One, he might have waited a little too long to change things up. Now, he did say that he was looking for that shock the locker room trade, but not always is there going to be a dance partner on the other end of things. And you look at the NHL in totality this year, there wasn't a lot of moves leading up to the deadline. There weren't a lot of mid-season trades. There wasn't a lot of action between general managers during December and early January. So maybe he just wasn't able to find a dance partner, and maybe that would have changed things for the Penguins if he was able to find one. So I do still think that he might have waited a little too long to make a substantial difference, and it took up until the NHL trade deadline when he moved out Jake Gensel, and that was a substantial difference. And after a week or two of wallowing in their self-pity, the Penguins kicked it into high gear and looked probably as good or better than they have in the past 2 seasons. So that did something for them. But at the end of the day, the team missed the playoffs and had a worse record. Now, overall, do I feel like they're in a better place than entering last offseason? Yes. But at the same time, the results speak for themselves. You had a worse record, you missed the playoffs, and you had a lot of inaction throughout the season as your team continued to show you exactly what they were. So for that reason, I give him a C, and it's teetering on a C-, but the official letter grade will be a C. So plenty of room to improve and plenty of time to improve for Kyle Dubas. He has a very long contract with the Pittsburgh Penguins, but we're going to take a quick break. When we return, a couple Pens are heading over to Europe for the World Championships. We'll discuss who and who could potentially join them after this break. Welcome back to the Tip of the Iceberg podcast, brought to you as always by InsideThePenguins.com. The Pens miss out on the biggest tournament of the year in hockey, which is the Stanley Cup playoffs. Been pretty entertaining so far, are the playoffs. I think they'd be a little bit better with some Sidney Crosby in them, but nonetheless, there's another tournament going on over in Czechia beginning May 10th, and there's going to be a couple of Pittsburgh Penguins taking place in that and participating in that. For Team Sweden, both Erik Karlsson and Marcus Pettersson are going to continue their 2024 season representing Sweden. Like I mentioned, Rickard Rakell was invited, but passes on the opportunity, said he's dealing with a shoulder injury. So 2 angles to take here. One, Karlsson and Pettersson, defensive partners. Will they play together in Czechia? Most likely, I would assume they do. And how do they end up looking for Team Sweden? I'm excited to see that. And 2, Rickard Rakell dealing with a shoulder injury. You can't go back and change what happened, but it might explain a little bit why he wasn't at his best all season long.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would. He missed a month, and then before even missing that month, he hadn't scored a goal yet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when the injury occurred. Maybe it was before then. I forget the whole timeline of it. But he missed that month between November and December, came back, got a handful of goals, then went on another scoreless streak. It was a rough season for him all around, but I mean, we're not here to hand out, excuses. But if you're dealing with a shoulder injury, that kind of hampers your shooting ability.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, it makes sense that I believe this is the second season in a row, by the way, he's turning down the Team Sweden invite because of an injury or because of an ailment that needs to be rested and worked on. We weren't given any updates on terms of it needs surgery, at least from Kyle Dubas, we weren't. And it just seems like just a natural progression of let it heal, come back next season stronger. Hopefully it doesn't affect anything going forward. And I mean, the IHF tournament's fun. It's cool to follow along with. I don't think too many of these guys are all that worried about it, and he's probably one of them. So, it's sucks to see his season, kind of affected by that all year. But on the bright side, we could see Erik Karlsson and Marcus Pettersson on the international stage a little more.
Yeah, those are the first two, and as of right now, the only two that are heading over to Czechia. The Raquel thing is interesting. Seth Rorabaugh of the Trib said that for the majority of the season after he came back, he was wearing a sleeve or a brace of some sort on that shoulder. So maybe it was something where when he came back, he's still dealing with it. They didn't want to have surgery. He wanted to be able to play through it. And as the season progressed, it just might have gotten a little bit better. And that's why things took off late in the season when he was with Bunting and Malkin. And it might have just been because Bunting and Malkin were better. But at the end of the day, we'll see what Rickard Rakell does. That, to me, the only thing that tells me is, okay, even more so, you trade Riley Smith before you trade Rickard Rakell. One, it's easier to trade Smith. Two, if Rakell was dealing with an injury and still outperformed Riley Smith, you bring back Rickard Rakell. But again, that's just, blanket statement on top of what we already, I think, have thrown out there as our opinion. Now, another team at the IAHF Worlds is awaiting somebody of pretty high standard. Now, they do have Kyle Dubas named assistant general manager, so Dubas will be involved in some Team Canada operations here before he gets started on the Pittsburgh Penguins offseason, if he isn't already. But Connor Bedard is already said to be joining Team Canada. Could another generational talent be joining him? Now, Sidney Crosby was asked about it at Locker Room Cleanout, and he matter-of-factly said, I'm going to give it some time before I make my decision on that. And he had time to make it. I mean, May 10th is still a couple of weeks away from today, and Locker Room Cleanout was about a week ago today. So it would be Sidney Crosby's third appearance in this tournament. 2006, after his rookie season in the NHL, he went over, scored 16 points in 9 games, and led the tournament in points, albeit in a 4th place finish for Team Canada. And then 9 years later, in 2015, he put up 9 points in 9 games and took home a gold medal, just added to the collection for Sidney Crosby. So a 9-year gap between his first 2 appearances in World Championships. It's been 9 years now since he took place in World Championships. Does he keep that same gap going and perform alongside Connor Bedard over in Czechia?
I bet he does. I think it's a good primer for all these international tournaments that are coming up. You get to play with Connor Bedard. You get to play with possibly, I think, Macklin Celebrini is supposed to be heading over. You get to rejoin forces with Brandon Tanev and Jared McCann are both heading over. And Kyle Dubas, obviously, in that front office. Team Canada is going to be a stacked team as usual in hockey. But it feels like this season more than usual because you're going to have the generational talents of Connor Bedard, possibly Sidney Crosby, Macklin Celebrini might be there. You're going to have some fun with Brandon Tanev on that team again. You're going to have fun with Jared McCann on that team. I'm forgetting other names, but I know that there's some other invites out there. In pretty short order, we should be getting more rosters. I think Team USA announced their first 15 yesterday. I think Drew O'Connor's not going back this year. I don't think not. I forget what he said in his exit interview.
Yeah.
I would be interested to see if Alex Nedeljkovic pops up on that roster somewhere. If was given an invite, considering the end of the season he had and the fact that Casey DeSmith was their starter last year. I don't think and the good American goalies are still in the playoffs. So I'd be interested to see if Nedeljkovic gets an invite or if what happens there. And I'm spitballing with that one. There's really no one else on the Penguins roster who, also it depends. P.O. Joseph was on Team Canada last year. So it depends on how things fall, because this is the tournament where it's like, where did this guy's playing on the international team really? That's that kind of tournament. It's hell to still be a part of and earn, the rights to quite a lot. It's part of the reason why Crosby is in the, what's it called? The Triple Gold Club. So it'll be interesting to see how things square out. I believe Crosby will go for sure.
Now, I think we all know what would really make Crosby want to go, and that's if his buddy Nathan MacKinnon loses in the first round, and all of a sudden him and McKinnon just recreate Euro trip between the two of them, and those two go over and join forces with Connor Bedard. That would certainly be something to watch since we haven't seen MacKinnon and Crosby play alongside each other for Team Canada yet in their lifetime. Obviously, the last time Crosby represented Team Canada was the 2016 World Cup of Hockey. Nathan MacKinnon did play in that tournament, but for the upstart Team North America. That was fun times back then. But at the end of the day, I don't know if he's going to do it because I think, one, he's 36 years old and really wants to come back and get the Penguins into the playoffs. And two, he's going to get opportunities to play in, as you mentioned, the Four Nations face-off coming up in 2025 and potentially, likely, the 2026 Winter Olympics. So does that make him shy away from doing it because he's going to have that international thirst quenched in a year or two? Or does he say, you know what? How many opportunities am I going to get to play with this young kid, Connor Bedard? How many opportunities am I going to get remaining to go out there and win gold medals for Team Canada? Because I think we can all agree if he goes and joins Bedard and Celebrini, it's going to be hard for anybody to take down Team Canada.
Yeah, I think one thing, too, though, that leans in favor of him going is as much as Team Canada is absolutely going to invite him to the Four Nations face-off. 2026 is still kind of far away. You never know what Father Time can bring for Sidney Crosby. Let's say he doesn't go this time and has ample opportunity to perform really well for. I know it's different regimes, kind of, and different team builds, or in terms of who's building the team, it changes for each tournament. But the overarching people don't change. If Crosby turns this down, I'm not saying he's going to be put in a bad light by them, but suddenly you're looking at 2026 as, okay, now you have to prove yourself in that year. I think just because he'll be a little bit older. He'll be 39. We know the amount of Canadian talent that's already coming in. We just mentioned Macklin Celebrini and Connor Bedard. Not to mention if certain other youngsters start to really explode, or who else even comes along. Connor McDavid will be there, obviously. Nathan McKinnon, obviously. It'll be interesting to see. And those are all centers we just named. So who knows? And I think it would be important for him to take it, even if he just plays a handful of games. Maybe they lose early. Who knows? Just being on that team and getting in the good graces of that sort of group of management and people who send the invites could be important. Also, side note, Jesse Puljujärvi might play for Finland. He's on that pre-tournament team right now.
Okay. Well, and nothing against you. The fact that anybody would turn down Sidney Crosby for Team Canada.
They did it once already. They've done it once already.
But still, at this point, if you're going to turn him down, especially for an Olympic Games.
They've done it once already. And that probably
whenever. What, 16?
18. It was the 2016.
Okay.
It was his rookie season whenever he absolutely should have been on that team.
He should have been on that team, but he was 18. Look at what he has done. Canada is nothing if not faithful to the people that have brought them what they need. And he has brought them what they need since they allowed him onto the team. There's a lot different people. Obviously, we don't need to get into Hockey Canada. That is a bucket of squirrels that we do not want to talk about. But I don't think there's any way, shape, or form that if Sidney Crosby wants to be on the Olympic roster in 2026, that anybody's going to tell him anything about it. First and foremost, because that's 2 seasons from now. He just came off a 94-point season. I don't think he's going to regress enough to be kicked out. And 2, because you just don't leave Sidney Crosby off the Olympic team. That's just, I'm sorry. I don't see that being anywhere near a possibility. And if it happens, people can come back to this, clip it, and call me ridiculous. But I don't think Canada is stupid enough to disrespect one of their greatest products in the history of hockey if he wants to represent his country one more time in wherever the 2026 Olympics are. I think Spain, Italy, exactly. So yeah, I would be very surprised, Horwat, if they were like, even if they're like, even if he moves over to wing, like they would move him to wing to play with McDavid. Even at 39 years old or 38 or whatever he would end up being, they're going to end up doing that. For 1, jersey sales, and for 2, he's probably going to get him another gold medal. Let's just put it that way.
I agree with you in terms of I agree with you that they shouldn't leave him off. I'm just saying, if more talent comes along, if these younger talents start to explode, and he is 39, let's say Father Time does catch up to him. Because again, that's unpredictable. You never know. There were times this season where we thought it might be getting there.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Because I do agree that, yes, Crosby probably should be on that team. You look at the calendar, though, and you figure it's 2 years down the line. You just never know.
Yeah.
I'm saying he should try and do everything he can to get in those good graces so that maybe he doesn't need to be at the top of his game. Like I said, at 18, they turned him down. Canada, you're right. Like when he's on that team, he brings them great things. Canada did not medal that year. They weren't even close.
That's because that year they tried to get all the old heads. They brought in none of the young talent. And I think you've seen in times that they have kind of started to do that a little bit more. So I do think,
and then why would they add an old head in 2026? And now we're getting
that old head is Sidney Crosby. It is Sidney Crosby. This is not Joe Thornton. This is not Brad Marchand in 2 years. This is Sidney Crosby. You don't leave him off, and I don't think he needs to be in. I don't think he needs to get in the good graces of anybody in Canada. I think he is permanently a fixture in the good graces, especially if he doesn't go to, as you alluded to, a fairly meaningless tournament in 2024 at the World Championships. So will he join this year? I think that remains to be seen. The 9-year gap is something that I would be very intrigued by, especially if he decides to go. I don't think he'd make it another 9 years. That's when I think we're getting a little ridiculous. But at the end of the day, if he wants to be on that team in 2026, he will be. But let's take a quick break. When we come back, a quick look at Wilkes-Barre Scranton's opener in the playoffs at the AHL level right after this break. Welcome back to the tip of the iceberg. You got my blood boiling a little bit there, Horwat. I don't know. It's a little too early on a Thursday morning to get my blood boiling in April. But the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, let's talk about them for a second. They opened up their AHL playoffs yesterday against the Lehigh Valley Phantoms. And if you're watching us on YouTube, we have the lineup from last night's game up on the screen. Vinny Hinostroza, Radim Zahorna, and Corey Andonovsky are the first line. But the line that I want to talk about, Horwat, Ville Koivunen making his Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins and his Pittsburgh Penguins organizational debut alongside Sam Poulin and Valtteri Puustinen. That could be the third line as soon as next year. Do you see, obviously they combined, Poulin and Koivunen combined for the lone goal last night for the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, but do you think that there is a world in which this line, Koivunen, Poulin, and Puustinen, end up being in the Penguins lineup next season?
I do think it could be, considering Kyle Dubas has said during his end of season press conference that he's expecting key prospects, to fight for NHL roles this upcoming training camp. I absolutely do think that could be a possibility. It's especially if they're already showing early signs of chemistry, one goal in a playoff game, but still, those two bare minimum showing and by two I mean Koivunen and Poulin, because those are new together. We just said Koivunen in his organizational debut. I mean, we were discussing way long ago the idea of a third line next year being Sam Poulin, Terry Puustinen, and Jesse Puljujärvi. Why not swap out for Koivunen? That's a solid trio that if this team wants to get younger, that's one way of doing it. If this team wants to get more offense heavy, especially in the bottom six, that's another way of doing it, especially considering the way they seem to look at Sam Poulin now as a two-way guy. You're still going to have that defense down there. And in this, it fits with what the goals, what the Penguins are looking for, and in terms of age and more offense for what I think they need to go for.
Yeah, honestly, when I look at this, I think the only question becomes, how many cooks are in the kitchen here, right? Because you also have Vasily Ponomarev that's going to be fighting for that. You mentioned, a guy like Jesse Puljujärvi. Talk about a guy that was centering the fourth line down there, but also looked pretty good. And Jonathan Gruden, does he fight for a fourth line spot? You also have some veterans there, Nola Chari and Lars Eller, and Matt Nieto, who's, again, still has another year left on his contract, who are going to, for right or wrong, as of right now, looking to be back in the lineup next season. Now, where does the offseason take us? Do any of those names end up getting shipped out? That remains to be seen, but definitely a good start whenever you look at the two guys connecting on the goal being Poulin and Koivunen, two guys that didn't make a substantial, effort at the NHL level. Now, Poulin played a couple this year. Koivunen is yet to make his NHL debut. Looked great for Oulun Karpat over of Liga, but Puustinen was the third name on that list, and Puustinen played over half a season. So I think it'd be interesting to see, especially hopefully they go on a run here so we get to see more of this line. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves, and maybe they start the year as that being their first line. Again, I got to see what Koivunen ends up doing. Obviously, I think he can go back to Karpat another year. I don't know if he's under contract, but again, that's all stuff that I need to do a little bit more digging into. But I think it's interesting that JD Forrest put those three together, maybe at the behest of Kyle Dubas saying, I want to see these three play together. But interesting that they got the start yesterday as the second line. Joel Blomqvist, obviously going to be a big name to watch in the AHL playoffs. 30 saves on 32 shots in a 2-1 loss to the Lehigh Valley Phantoms. All this excitement hopefully doesn't end soon because they're down 1-0 in a best-of-3 series. Backs up against the wall. Game 2 is on Friday. If they lose, they're done. And all this was for 2 games. If they win, they extend it, and it's a winner-take-all against Lehigh Valley on Sunday. But that's going to do it for this episode of The Tip of the Iceberg. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Again, remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.